So this week, a second global sigh of relief. Not just one COVID vaccine, but two. With trials from Moderna showing their vaccine is nearly 95% effective, 1 billion people could be immunized against coronavirus by the end of 2021. But which billion people? Who will get the vaccine first and who might miss out? And with an American company and a German-American company leading the way, how might the vaccination program be politicized? On today's debate, the geopolitics of the vaccine. Will the rollout be unequal? Join the conversation today on Facebook and on Twitter. The hashtag is F24Debate. And let me start our program by welcoming our two guests for the first half of the debate. That's Zori Moon, the co-director of the Global Health Centre at the Graduate Institute for International Development Studies in Geneva. Thank you very much for being on the program today.
Thanks so much for having me.
And also Jaap Boom, he is the regional representative for Epicenter Africa, that is the research body of Doctors Without Borders. He's joining us today from the Cameroonian capital, Yaoundé. Good evening to you, sir.
Good evening.
Before we hear from both of you on this crucial topic, I want to start with a little recap of what we know about the new Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer one. Here's France 24's James Vecina.
They claim it's the most effective vaccine against Covid-19 so far. A second glimmer of hope that the battle against the virus could be nearing its end. Moderna says its vaccine is 94.5% effective and hopes to get it out by the end of the year.
The first agreement that we reached with the US government was for an order of 100 million doses. So we anticipate to be able to ship up to 20 million of those 100 million before the end of the year. So we are making product, as you know, every day and stockpiling it. And assuming we get the green light from the FDA, I would say sometime in December, I'm sure General Perna from Operation Warp Speed will be ready with the trucks to load the product and to distribute it in the US via the CDC guidelines.
Of the 30,000 participants in the study, half of them were given a placebo rather than the vaccine. A first analysis found that of 95 participants who'd gone on to contract COVID-19, 90 of them had received the placebo, while only 5 who developed mild symptoms were given the drug. Moderna claims it's particularly effective with more fragile patients and that doses can be stored in a fridge or a freezer for up to 30 days, a step well ahead of rival company Pfizer, whose vaccine proved to be 90% effective but must be kept below 80 degrees Celsius. The lifespan could allow for wider distribution, but some say it's still too early to cheer.
For now, this is a business announcement, not a scientific one. We don't know how long the immunity lasts. The trial has only been going for 2 months.
If approved, the company hopes to ship out 1 billion doses next year. 2 doses taken 2 weeks apart are required for protection against COVID-19.
Well, you heard it there at the end of that report. 1 billion vaccine doses by the end of 2021. That's the plan. But the doses are hot property. Some 100 million doses have already been set aside for American citizens, some 5 million for Brits, and somewhere between 80 and 180 million for citizens of the EU. So I think it's pretty clear then who's going to be at the front of the queue for the vaccine. So who's going to be at the back? Zori Moon, let me bring you in first of all. Are you concerned that wealthy Western countries are already buying up so much of the vaccine?
I am concerned, and I think it's very clear that indeed the wealthiest countries in the world have tried very hard to secure as much vaccine supply for themselves as possible. This is understandable from a purely national perspective, but if we take a step back and we think about the world as a whole, and we think about the fact that this pandemic has affected every country on the planet, we cannot only think about just a handful of countries. We have to think about how can we get enough vaccines that are safe and effective, manufactured and affordable to be able to be used in all countries where they're needed. Unfortunately, that's not the situation that we're in right now.
Absolutely not. And on that note, let me bring in Jaap Boom. As I said, you're joining us today from Cameroon. And I know that some of the concerns here are about logistics. There are parts of the world where we have vaccines for diseases that are treatable, like diphtheria, like measles, but children are still dying of those diseases because we don't have the infrastructure in place to to dispatch those vaccines. Are you concerned that even if the vaccine is available, that we won't be able to roll it out safely in parts of Africa?
Well, I think first thing first, the first question we will ask ourselves is that we have that announcement with those very good and promising results on the efficacy. But we would have preferred, as for all the other vaccine, to have a scientific evidence provided to the people so that we know that the vaccine is actually not only efficacious but also safe. If you have a vaccine that is 90% safe or efficacious, you are in Africa where we now know that 94, if not more, of the population affected by the virus will survive. So at some point we can first ask ourselves to which extent this vaccine is fitting our environment and context. Now for the logistic, definitely we have a lot of challenges, and also those challenges will depend on different countries. But as you highlight, one of the two vaccines is more user-friendly for our environment. That might be one of the vaccine that we might go for, because few countries have the capacity to have the -80, especially now as we are going through the pandemic.
Well, as you mentioned, the temperature of storing the vaccines is a concern. The one that we heard a little bit about last week, the Pfizer one, needs to be stored in very cold temperatures. That will be a challenge, as you say, in lots of places that are still developing countries. The Moderna vaccine doesn't need to be held at such low temperatures, but it's a more expensive vaccine. Zorimun, let me come to you. Should it be incumbent on richer nations to waive the cost of this vaccine?
I think first we have to remember that we've seen results from 2 vaccine candidates. There are 11 that are now in the latest stages of clinical development, what we call phase 3. And in the coming weeks and months, I think we can expect to see a lot more results. There are a number of other vaccine candidates that might be much easier to roll out. So for example, we have one that's being developed by Johnson & Johnson that will only require 1 shot instead of 2, and that would really decrease the cost quite a lot for all countries. We have other vaccines that may not need to be stored in nearly as cold a temperature, certainly as the Pfizer candidate. And last but not least, we don't know the prices of many of the vaccines, but some of them we know will be much, much lower than, for example, the Moderna candidate. So, for example, the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, we hope will be priced at around $3 to $4 per dose, and that's 10 times less than the price that has been floated for the Moderna candidate. So I think that waiting a few weeks or even a couple of months to see which are going to be the vaccines that are that offer the best value for money, that will be the easiest to deliver. I think this is a better way forward than jumping with every press release that every company issues.
Absolutely. So we need to be cautious, as you said, take our time. There's still many vaccines still in development. Boom, let me bring you in again. Do you agree that now is a time to be cautious? There's been much excitement in the past couple of days, talk of the light at the end of the tunnel. From the communities that you're speaking to, from the work that you're doing with Doctors Without Borders in Cameroon, what's the reaction been to this news?
You know, the reaction is quite ambiguous, because first of all, if you remember, there was that issue with the vaccine trial in Africa, which brought a lot of noise in our countries, and a lot of people being a bit skeptical about the vaccine. So we have to work on that, and then we need to have vaccine that we are confident about. So I will agree with Sari, we need to take our time, not too much, but to have all the different options. And depending on the option available, then we will be in a position to decide which vaccine fit best for our context. In terms of funding, in terms of logistical implication, in terms of safety, as I mentioned, we don't have the same challenge as the Western people have now. So we might go more for a vaccine that is safest as compared to countries where the number of people dying is much more important. So we are still looking at all those options, and then based on what will be available, we'll be in a position to make a decision.
All right. I want to listen to something that the director of the World Health Organization said a few days ago. He was speaking about some of the challenges of rolling out the vaccine and the importance of global cooperation. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
In our interconnected world, if people in low and middle income countries miss out on vaccines, the virus will continue to spread and the economic recovery globally will be delayed. Equitable access is in the national interest of each and every country. Vaccine nationalism will prolong the pandemic, not shorten it. Making vaccines work requires a broad collaboration, not just across sectors, but across partners. No country can address these challenges alone.
Vaccine nationalism will prolong the pandemic. Zori Moon, let me come to you first. What does he mean by vaccine nationalism there? And do you agree that that's a real concern here?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that Dr. Tedros has been very consistent in calling for more global cooperation, which is absolutely what we need if we want people to have fair and equitable access to potentially a life-saving technology. I think one of the big problems is that we have right now a situation where most of the world's vaccine supply has already been reserved by a handful of the wealthiest countries. And that includes, of course, European countries, North America, and Japan. What we know is that in order to save the most lives and in order to try to really stop the spread of this pandemic, what we need is to vaccinate those who are most vulnerable first across all countries, right? And that includes health workers, other frontline workers, those who are older, those who have underlying health conditions. And so that's what makes sense from an ethical point of view. That's what makes sense from a public health and epidemiological point of view. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is that we have a real sort of law of the jungle at stake here, where the most powerful players, the wealthiest countries, are trying to push everybody out of the way and have been quite successful actually in doing that, pushing to the front of the line to get the most vaccines possible. At the same time, I think we do have to recognize that it's the same countries largely who are also supporting multilateral initiatives like the COVAX initiative. So they're in fact kind of taking some vaccines with one hand and perhaps offering them with another. It's not exactly the most logical system that we're seeing, unfortunately.
And I wanted to ask about some of the kind of politics that's fed into that vaccine nationalism. Jaap Boom, perhaps let me bring you in on that. Donald Trump is, of course, set to leave the White House, but nonetheless, he's been very clear that vaccine doses will be for Americans first. Has that American approach, that America First approach, had a ripple effect, do you think, on a race for a vaccine and affected perhaps how it might be rolled out in Africa?
I do think it has. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Boom first, please, and then I'd like to hear from Zori Moon.
Yes, so I would say that it will definitely have an impact on what will be available in Africa. But I also believe that those initiatives led by WHO and maybe Gavi, some of the people will bring their voice. And then also, last week, the African Union CDC aide, Dr. Kingaston, was in Cameroon, and he was highlighting that African countries also has to put their hand in their pocket and have some money, and that money should also be put under the table, because all what has been mentioned, the discussion is mainly between the rich countries, and then we will receive what will be left over. So we definitely need as well to define who will receive the vaccine and how much we can as well put under the table so that we can access what is needed in terms of vaccine quality and that will fit to our environment.
Yeah, Zori Moon, I do want to bring you in, but I just want to follow up with what you just said there, Jaap Boom, about the importance of research within Africa. I was reading a little bit today about the history of medical colonialism in Africa, and that because of processes like that, including with Pfizer, which is the company that's been behind one of these major vaccines that is set to be rolled out, there is a good degree of distrust across the continent regarding vaccines. Do you think that that's true, and how can that be combated?
Well, as a matter of fact, the question that African will ask to ourselves is how many of those vaccines have actually been tested in Africa in those trials, and the answer most likely will be none. And now we will be receiving a vaccine which we don't know the adverse effect in our community. So that's also, it's adding up on the distrust that people have been having in mind about the colonialism and taking African as guinea pig. While we know that it's not true, we've been testing Ebola vaccine in Guinea, in DRC, and so on, and find some good results. So by doing those trials in the continent, having those evidence from the continent bring more trust than what is happening now.
So a call from you there to have more research, more development, more testing in Africa. Zorimun, let me bring you in. I know you wanted to speak a while ago about vaccine nationalism. What are your thoughts on what you've just been hearing?
I think one of the less well understood aspects of what's going on right now is exactly what my colleague, Mr. Boom, was referring to, which is that many countries, developing countries included, are not sitting back and waiting for a handout, or they're not waiting for a solution to be handed to them. You have many governments that are, in fact, trying to get access to vaccines themselves. A number of middle-income countries, a number of countries that are participating in clinical trials, including in the Middle East, South Africa, across Latin America, in Southeast Asia. And so there are, in fact, a number of bilateral vaccine deals between Western firms, Chinese firms, the Russian Gamaleya Institute, and developing countries for access to vaccine supplies. So I think the picture is not so black and white, and initiatives like the African CDC saying, we have money we're willing to put on the table, that the problem is actually getting access to volume. I mean, this is one of the challenges that we have seen, is that when wealthy countries bid against each other, along with this logic of vaccine nationalism, they bid up the price for everybody, and they take all of the supply and leave very little left for there's very little left for the rest of the world. So we have a kind of a breakdown in cooperation happening at the international level. Now, this breakdown really began certainly in the earliest months of this pandemic, but it did get worse when the U.S. made it very clear that it was not going to support any kind of multilateral initiative for vaccine access, and that it was not going to share the very considerable stockpile of vaccines that the United States has secured access to. And so I think this really set off a panic in many other wealthy countries, including in Europe and in Japan, where other wealthy countries said, if we can't rely on international cooperation, we're going to have to grab some for ourselves in the same way that the U.S. has grabbed some for itself. So we've seen this kind of cascading effect of vaccine nationalism that unfortunately has left pretty much everybody worse off.
Yeah, and as you said, that race for a vaccine isn't over yet. It will continue. It's time for a short break on the debate, but I want to thank you both very much for being with us. Zorimun and Jaap Boom, thank you very much indeed. Do stay with us, though. Part two of the debate is coming up very shortly. We're going to discuss the anti-vaxxer movement, as well as the ethics of making money from the pandemic. Do stay with us. It's time now for part two of the France 24 debate, where we look at the rollout of the vaccine. In this half, we're going to talk about the anti-vaxxer movement, as well as vaccines and big money. But before we do, it is worth pointing out that vaccine skepticism has been growing, particularly here in the West. Now, in China, more than 80% of people recently said they would take a vaccine if it was considered to be safe. Now, in the US, that drops to around 75% of people, while here in France, only 58% said they would definitely take a vaccine. That means some 40% of people in France don't plan to be vaccinated. A key question, though, being discussed here in France is, does that mean vaccinations should be mandatory? Valérie Decamp has a look.
Excitement or skepticism. The French have reacted to the prospect of a COVID-19 vaccine with mixed feelings. In a recent survey, 54% said they would agree to take the jab, while nearly 2/3 are against making it obligatory. Many in the political class have spoken in favor of such a move. Now the question on everyone's mind is, can France force people to get vaccinated? The short answer is yes.
Lawmakers can, in order to preserve public health and to combat the spread of an epidemic or a serious disease, make a vaccine mandatory for the French people. And I believe we are in a situation like that.
As stipulated by the law, France's National Health Authority is in charge of making recommendations about a vaccine. But eventually, it's up to the health ministry to decide. In 2018, the government made a total of 11 vaccinations compulsory for school children, including diphtheria, tetanus, and polio. But for the time being, when it comes to a COVID-19 vaccine, the National Health Authority has already opposed a mandatory shot.
In light of the uncertainty surrounding the delivery of the first doses of a vaccine and the fact that we still don't know enough about a potential vaccine and its ability to limit the spread of the virus, making it mandatory would be unjustified.
The health body adding that doing so could be counterproductive, sparking a backlash from the French public. France is already among the countries with the lowest acceptance rate of a COVID-19 vaccine.
Well, listening to that report was both of our guests for the second half of the debate, Else Torelli, a researcher in global health in Geneva, as well as Bernice Hausmann, a professor of public health at Penn State College of Medicine and the author of the book Anti-Vax, Reframing the Vaccination Controversy. Welcome to you both. Thank you very much for being on the programme. Else Torelli, let me start with you, if I may. Just before you joined us, I gave our viewers a couple of statistics about reticence towards the vaccine, pointing out that some 40% of people here in France at the moment would be unwilling to be vaccinated. Why do you think vaccine skepticism, not just here in France, is on the rise?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I'm not an expert in vaccines hesitancy. I think we have a colleague here who will talk more about that. But in the specific context of COVID, I think that there is a growing unease because there is a feeling that we don't have, that there are too many interests at stake that do not necessarily are good for our public health. We've seen the announcements of companies that come forward with good data, but without really showing the data. We don't have the full transparency about what's going on. We know that there are massive financial interests at stakes, and that gives the feeling that maybe, not everything is in the public interest or in the interest of public health.
Okay, perhaps not everything in the interest of public health. Bernice Hausmann, as Elise Torre said, you're the expert on anti-vaxxers. Is there any reason to be fearful of taking the vaccine, in your view?
Well, I think that people have concerns for a variety of reasons that are historically long-standing. So whenever there's a new vaccine developed, there's more hesitancy about uptake because vaccines in general, the safety monitoring really occurs after they're licensed and approved for use. So phase 3 clinical trial might include 30,000 or 60,000 people, but if you have a rare serious side effect that only occurs 1 in 100,000 people or 1 in a million people, you don't see it until the vaccine is rolled out, and then the monitoring after it's used identifies those rare but sometimes serious side effects. So people are always concerned when a new vaccine is created and disseminated, and especially I think calling this Operation Warp Speed has actually increased concerns among some people because it suggests that we may be developing the vaccine quickly, but not paying attention to all of the necessary safety and efficacy protocols. So there are concerns that I think that a lot of people share, not just ideological vaccine dissenters who are always going to be opposed to vaccination, but many people have concerns about the way that this particular vaccine has been, or these vaccines are being developed. On the other hand, the information that's coming from the two companies in the United States that have disseminated information about efficacy is that it's quite high, and that might change people's perceptions around their acceptance of the vaccine.
Let me stay with you on that point, if I may, Bernice Houseman, before I bring back in Ms. Torley. It is true, though, isn't it? As you say, yes, there are some legitimate concerns, particularly around how fast this vaccine has been developed, but that particularly where you are in the United States, there is a growing mistrust of the scientific community of scientists. I wonder if you think that that's something that's been promoted by Donald Trump.
I think we've seen explicit federal messing around in the routine regulatory processes of the FDA and the CDC. So in many ways, this summer has, this spring, summer, and fall has confirmed some of the fears that vaccine dissenters have said have always been in place, right? So one of the arguments against vaccines is that the government and pharmaceutical companies and the medical profession are all sort of in bed together in problematic ways, and that therefore you can't trust the safety and efficacy data that pharmaceutical companies provide for vaccines. And then with this summer, what we've seen is explicit attempts to manipulate the process by the federal government in a way that I think has confirmed the concerns of what I would call the sort of ideological vaccine dissenters, people who are really against all vaccinations and make very vocal political arguments against them. And so to a certain extent, then you have a lot of people who would not have put themselves in the vaccine hesitancy camp before COVID, who are now looking at the situation and wondering if they can trust the government. And you actually have some organizations like the National Medical Association, which is an organization of African-American physicians that was created years and years ago when the American Medical Association didn't accept Black doctors. And they are so concerned that they are arguing that they're going to conduct their own safety data evaluation before they recommend the vaccine.
I think there's a really interesting financial aspect to all of this, and I want to bring in Els Torley on that, if I may. You know, I think for a long time, the kind of pharmaceutical industry has been seen as being driven by corporate interests, not necessarily by the interests of public health. But we are now in the midst of this absolutely unprecedented pandemic. Do you think this is kind of a moment to reform the public image of Big Pharma?
Well, I think that's certainly what is going on to some extent, but whether that is justified or not is a wholly different thing. I think what we can see is that the companies are still envisaging to make a lot of money out of this pandemic. I mean, it's unprecedented. Billions of people that would need a vaccine, that is an enormous potential windfall for the companies. That is why so many vaccine candidates are being moved forward, because there is a hugely profitable business case to be made. Moreover, and that is also unprecedented, governments are so much looking out at pharmaceutical companies to bring those solutions. So they are actually financing in unprecedented ways. They're financing the research and development to a large extent. They're pre-financing the scale-up of manufacturing capabilities by the companies, and they are pre-financing the purchase of the vaccines by all these advanced market commitments. So all of that is an enormous risk-taking financially that is now being taken over by the governments. So the risk for the companies are relatively minor, but as we have seen in the announcements of some of the pricing of the vaccines, and also what we see how the stock markets react, there is an enormous windfall to be expected. So I think maybe the discourse is that they do it for public health, but the reality is that there will be a lot of money being made by the shareholders of the companies and by the CEOs of the companies. As you know, the CEO of Pfizer, the data they announced in a very flimsy press release, some good data that we still have to see confirmed. He gained personally $5.5 million by cashing in his stock options. That's kind of, if you know that the nurses and the doctors that are actually on a daily basis struggle to combat COVID, their salary will be like, maybe a few thousands maximum.
It is unethical then, in your view, what happened at Pfizer? The selling of its shares for 5.6 million.
Well, it shows, I mean, it's not, the point is not whether that act is unethical. It shows that we have a system, a value, the value chain of pharmaceutical R&D is that very few people and corporations gain a lot of money, while the distribution of risks taking and investments and rewards is totally skewed. That the governments take a lot of risk, put a lot of investment, and then they're going to pay a high price at the end. The companies that own the patents, they gain all the rewards, while there is massive investments of plenty of people upstream and downstream. So there is a total skewing of who gets the rewards and who takes the risks and who makes the investments.
Yeah, I want to bring in Bernice Hausmann on that, if I may. In the first part of our debate, we were talking a little bit about the cost of these vaccines. The new one that we've been talking about this week, the Moderna vaccine, is far more expensive than the Pfizer one for the moment. In your view, given what we've been hearing from Bernice Hausmann about the sheer amount of money that many of these companies are set to make, do you think it should be incumbent on richer nations like the United States, where you are, to subsidize or perhaps even waive the cost of vaccines for poorer countries?
Well, in terms of global public health, that would be the best option. And it's terrifying to me the way that wealthy countries have already sort of conscripted vaccine doses for their own populations, not regarding the public health needs of poorer countries. There's been kind of quite a bit of press about these problems, and it's sort of horrifying. But I guess in keeping with the sort of creeping nationalism that we see globally. From the perspective of public health, and I should indicate I'm not actually, I have an appointment in public health, but my primary appointment is in humanities. So public health itself is not my primary field. I think that but I think I've been reading that in terms of actually slowing and stopping the spread of coronavirus, there is a strong argument for providing vaccines at very low cost to developing countries. Because of the number of lives that would be saved overall would be significant.
Elsa Torley, do you agree? Big pharma, rich countries need to make these effectively free for poorer nations?
Well, I want to take us back a step here, because you are talking about the cost. I think we need to make a distinction between the cost and the price. And the price that companies are charging is arbitrary. They choose which price they ask for a vaccine, and that has not necessarily a direct connection between the cost of the production. I mean, many health advocates have been demanding companies to, at least for COVID, given the massive subsidies that they got, that they should make the products available at cost plus a little margin. But most of the vaccine companies have absolutely refused to do that. So then asking for governments who have already subsidized the research and development and the scale-up of the manufacturing to again pay this far too high price to then subsidize the poor countries, I think that's a little bit too much. I think where we need to go through is that these vaccines need to be made available at the lowest possible cost and made available for free for the people that need it, that's for sure. But that is globally the case. I don't see a reason why, after having subsidized so much already the development and availability of these vaccines, that we have to then also pay a higher price than cost plus a little margin. I mean, the companies can make a little profit, but not to the extent that what we are seeing now, certainly for these mRNA vaccines that are priced at really high prices.
Yeah, you've both talked a little bit here about sort of the vaccine nationalism and what has felt like a race or a competition between different nations for a vaccine. Bernice Hausmann, you touched on this a bit earlier, but I want to ask you really directly, has that competition rather than coordination between nations meant that some vaccines, perhaps in Russia, for example, perhaps in other parts of the world, may not be as safe as they should be?
Well, certainly we know that the vaccines that have been disseminated in Russia and I believe also in China have not gone through the same 3 phases of clinical trials with all of the safety data that is being mandated for them, at least in the United States and I believe elsewhere. So I think that my sense is that that's correct, that they're basically they're doing the phase 3 clinical trial on the entire population that they're vaccinating. But it bears, so, and it's very important that we recognize the importance of the rigor of the scientific methods that goes into determining whether vaccines are safe with the existing protocols. But I do want to, emphasize that with all vaccines, the monitoring after licensure and approval is extremely important to establishing the true safety profile of the vaccine, because both safety and efficacy, as they are determined in the context of a clinical trial, are far more controlled than when vaccines are disseminated in a general population, because there are going to be more mistakes made in administration. There may be things that turn up, as I said before, that are rare, but they turn up when you're giving the vaccine to millions, and in this case, billions of people. There would also be particularly, small changes in the way people administer that you would find various reactions that would show up. So it's really, really important to understand that clinical trials on a few tens of thousands of people are never going to give you the kind of sort of longitudinal and numbers-based safety data that you're going to get from post-licensure monitoring.
All right, I want to bring in Els Torley, if I may. At some point, it appears that we're going to have to vaccinate everybody in the world, 7 billion people. This is going to be, I suspect, the largest, one of the most complex vaccination programs in decades, if not in modern history. Just give us a sense, if you can, what do you think are the biggest challenges here when it comes to rolling out a vaccine program on literally a global scale?
Well, I would like to caution against generalizing the fact that everybody will need to be vaccinated, because so far, based on what we know of the vaccines, first of all, we don't know that much yet. I mean, let's not forget that the preliminary data, that we have today show us that there is 90 or 94% efficacy for people getting symptomatic disease in the first few weeks after the second dose of vaccination. We don't know whether they will, after a month or after 2 months, still be protected. We also, very importantly, do not know whether there is actually protection against infection. We only know that there is some protection on a short term, at least, against symptomatic disease. This is really, really important. And so I don't think that we can today say that everybody needs to be vaccinated with the vaccines that we have. We will have to see, and when a number of vaccines are available, they will have different types of efficacy and safety profiles, etc. And then we need to think very carefully which populations, subpopulations in which countries, depending on how the pandemic evolves, will benefit most of these vaccines. And I think that the idea of wide coverage, one size fits all, is really not helpful. And the problem is that because of the mechanism that we have, that companies just produce vaccines and they will supply them, and now with the nationalism, governments buy them, we don't have an approach that actually looks what is the public health strategy to actually combat the pandemic with the available tools, which may be one or multiple vaccines with different characteristics, which may be also some treatments. We need to look at the whole. And today there is this rush towards, as you asked the question, as if everybody now needs to be vaccinated with these first few vaccines. well, maybe not. Let's take a real public health approach to it.
And let's take a step back. As you say, there is still a long road ahead. I want to thank you both very much for being on the programme today. Els Torrellet, Bernice Hausman, thank you both very much. Unfortunately, that's it for the debate. It's clear there is so much more that we could be talking about, but we will have to leave it there. Thank you very much to them, and thank you for watching France 24. More world news just after this.